Throughout the years, many people in society have used the term African American to describe the blacks that are in America. Ironically, that term is not used for the people that come to the continent or the United States today from the continent of Africa. And so black Americans have been running around lacking an identity. And history has been hidden from us for so long that when someone tries to educate us, we want to reject that knowledge. In Lewis Carroll's writing Through the Looking Glass, it actually reads, when I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said, in rather a scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. And in 1915, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History was started by Carter G. Woodson. And another gentleman, I can't think of the other gentleman's name right now. But it would actually change to Negro History Week to honor Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass in 1926, I believe. And even though he's not given much credit, he's barely one of the rarely mentioned presidents today. Gerald Ford actually expanded Negro History Week into a full month, and we started calling it Black History Month at that point. But it wasn't always black history. It was always referred to as Negro history. And there's been much accomplishment that blacks can celebrate, or Negroes can celebrate, not African Americans. And many black women and men seem to have a problem being identified as Negroes. But if we study our past history, every person of color identified themselves as Negroes, not African American. I mean, like I just mentioned, Carter G. Woodson started Negro History Week, the Association for the Study of Negro Life. Marcus Garvey's organization was Universal Negro Improvement. Booker T. Washington was National Negro Business League. So everything was identified as Negro. And so every publication in the past, whether it be an article or a book from all of these bygone eras, identified our ancestors as Negroes, not African American. And we need to wonder why. And I'm going through some information, and it was saying that the word Negro was first used in the year 1900 census to actually identify those blacks who came to the 13 colonies. But that's not even correct, because James Walker Hood, he was a black delegate, Bishop James Walker Hood. He actually used the term on the Florida North Carolina Constitutional Convention in 1888. And Blanche Kelso Bruce, who was the first Negro to serve a full term in the Senate, said he was proud to be a Negro. And ironically, Bruce served in the Senate from 1875 to 1881. And if we just study history a little bit more, we would see that the word was actually first used in 1442 as a derivative of the word Niger. Why did our ancestors that were closest to the institution of slavery identify themselves as Negroes? If there has been confusion about how to identify ourselves, who were we before our names kept being changed? The word Afro-American was first used in 1892 as the name of a black newspaper, since blacks were said to be of African descent. Now, blacks did come out of Africa through the triangular slave trade, but they went to West Africa and settled in West Africa after they had left East Africa, after they had left their home in Jerusalem. So you figure that one out. But it's still we call it the Middle East today, but all of that is linked up to the continent of Africa. And the only reason that got separated because of trade routes when they built the Suez Canal to allow ships trading routes that where they wouldn't have to go around the whole continent to actually get across to do business over in the other countries. Study that a little bit for yourself. But the word African American wasn't used until 1899, but neither one of those words ever caught on. And we have to wonder why these blacks during slavery and right out of it refused to be called Afro or African American. Could it be that they truly knew who they were? When they were marched onto the slave ships, the buyers would separate the men from the women and the women from the boys and girls. And for one, separating the men from the women allowed the slave bosses to have sex at will with the women and sometimes the men. That's just how sick they were, or whatever you want to call it. But the main reason they separated the men from the women and the women from the kids, or the grown-ups from the youth, was so the older folks couldn't pass on the history of their ancestors to the kids. And Karl Marx, and many of you have heard Karl Marx, and the funny thing is, a lot of us are advocating what Karl Marx was teaching. I don't even understand how we could advocate following a guy who was talking about everybody being slaves. But he didn't call it that. He called it communism, or what we term socialism, which is actually communism light. So I don't even know why we even want to follow an ideology like that. But this ain't the talk for that one. But Karl Marx said, if you take away the heritage of a people, they are easily destroyed. And look at us as a people in this country and other countries around the world. We're destroyed. And, we keep sitting there trying to identify it as somebody else. Because we don't want to, a lot of us don't even want to pay attention to the Bible because we want to say the Bible's a European doctrine. Well, let me tell you something. The Hebrew Negroes had the Bible before the Europeans came. And the Europeans actually came, and through slavery and everything, they adopted the principles of the Bible and actually intermingled that with a lot of their pagan worship. So they have a skewed version, but they still had the Bible. And then they brought it back to us and our ancestors, and they use particular verses to show us that slavery was biblical, like master, obey your servant and turn a blind eye to those who despitefully misuse you. And those are certain verses they pulled out to show that we were supposed to be in that position as a people. But the further we move away from slavery, the more we try to identify with a group of people that we're not, because our identity was stripped from us. And that's why we run around here wanting to claim Egypt all the time. And Egyptians were black, but we're not Egyptian. And we need to understand that, because Egypt had a lot of great knowledge. And so we want to identify with that. But if you read in the Bible and in some of the missing books of the Bible, you'll actually see who really built Egypt and those other great civilizations on that continent. It was the Hebrews that they enslaved. And a lot of blacks are trying to discredit that because they don't believe that true Hebrews were black. But the Hebrew slaves built those civilizations, and the Egyptians took credit for it. Just like the Hebrew slaves built America, and Europeans and everybody else took credit for it. But you do your own research. I have stacks and stacks of information. Stacks and stacks. Information, books, articles, videos, everything. And Malcolm X, he was one of our leaders in the 60s. And once he left the Nation of Islam, and many of those in the civil rights establishment considered the word Negro and color to be offensive, as well as being called black. And in the place of these words, Afro-American took foot again in the 60s, and in the 70s, African-American would slowly start to come back around as the official designation of us blacks in America. And in the early 80s, it would be used more and more often. But it really wasn't until 1987 that the use of the word African American would really grab hold, and that's when artist Johnny Duncan wrote a poem titled "I Can." And this poem actually appeared in the yearly black calendar until 1993. And, you know, Jesse Jackson saw a copy of the poem in calendar in 1989, and that Johnny Duncan had sent to Coretta Scott King. And then he worked with Ramona Edlin and a few others and made the push to use the term AFR, I can, AMER, I can, African American. And for the most part, the word Negro was used as the identifier up through the latter part of the 20th century, until Jesse Jackson and other self-appointed black leaders went to Congress and asked to be identified as African Americans in December of '89. And if we were to find some of the older maps of the place we call Africa, we would actually find a place that was once called Negro Land. And Negro Land was the name that identified West Africa at one point in history. And when we look at that map, we'll see a place called the Slave Coast, you know, for obvious reasons. And there's speculation that Africa was named after a Roman general named Scipio Africanus. And however, one thing is certain. America is named after an Italian explorer named Amerigo Vespucci, or Americus Vespucius, depending on your translation. And I'm not sure of the African name, you know, don't say I said it, but you know, it does raise some questions. Because Flavius Josephus also said that Africa was named after Abraham's son Ophron in the book The Antiquities of the Jews. And you know, if you know your Bible a little bit, you understand that Abraham was the first person to ever be designated as Hebrew by God. And so, according to Josephus, that's where Africa got the name from Abraham's son Ophron. And so if Africanus proves to be accurate, because like I said, I don't know. As blacks, we're running around identifying ourselves after two Europeans, Romans at that. And study you some Roman history and it's beginning to make a lot more sense to you. And no wonder we confused as a people. Romans are behind our ancestors leaving their original homeland and losing everything that was valuable, including their identity. I mean, where did you get Caesar Borgia from as that picture of the white Christ? It came straight out the Vatican from Pope Borgio, his dad. And so, who ran our ancestors out of Jerusalem in 70 A.D.? It was Romans. So, we got some things to think about. Former Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser said in 1952, "You the Jews will never be able to live here in Israel in peace because you left here black and you came back white." Now, what have we seen in Israel since the United States recognized them in 1958? We've seen nothing but turmoil in that region of the world. And Dr. Alexander Falconbridge wrote a book titled An Account on the Slave Trade on the Coast of Africa. And Dr. Falconbridge was actually employed on one of the slave ships, and he took, I think, 4 voyages, if I'm not mistaken. And once he saw how brutal that those shipmasters and taskmasters were treating those people, he decided to leave off the ship and become an abolitionist. But in his book, in which I've read, he identified African and Negroes as 2 separate people. Now, a young man named Roland Barton wrote W.E.B. Du Bois letter in 1928. And he was upset because we were calling ourselves Negro, and he thought it was a white man's word. And in Dr. Du Bois' reply, he told Roland Boyd, Negro is a fine word. Etymologically and phonetically, and sorry if I messed that word up, butchered it a little bit, it's much better and more logical than African or colored, or any of the various hyphenated circumlocutions. I had to write that one down because I couldn't really remember how to pronounce that one. And he said, historically, and of course, your dislike of the word Negro is easily explained. Negroes among your grandfathers meant black folk. Colored people were mulattoes. The mulattoes hated and despised the blacks and were insulted if they were called Negroes. And we look a lot at that today. We got a lot of dark-skinned versus light-skinned blacks. You know, that was a big issue during the NBA Finals. People made a big issue about that. And see why we can't come together. We don't even like the dark-skinned black people. It's just crazy. But we let society paint that in front of us, and we follow behind it. But if a thing is despised, this is still Dr. Du Bois, either because of ignorance or because it is despicable, you will not alter matters by changing its name. If men despise Negroes, they will not despise them less if Negroes are called colored or Afro-Americans. So, as long as we are confused about who we are, and we allow others to dictate and tell us our ancestry, we will never truly advance as we should. Read Psalms 83, 3 and 4, I believe, where it talks about we're going to forget who we are. And if people have spent their entire existence hiding all of our accomplishment, all of our identity, all of our family ancestry, and all of our history, why would they allow us to keep the name Afro-American if that's who we really were? Do you think they would allow us to be African-American if that's who we were? If that's who we truly were? This whole process has actually been one of the greatest misdirection acts ever performed. And as black Americans, Negroes, Hebrews, we still haven't figured it out. Now, when I mention Hebrew, Negro, things like that, just want to make it clear, your skin color is not going to get you salvation. That's a choice you're going to have to make regardless of what color you are. But we need to talk about this issue because this issue has been hidden from us for so long. You know, Japanese know they're Japanese. You know, Italians know they're Italians. Hispanics know they're Hispanics. And all Caucasians know where they came from, ancestry-wise. Only thing we know is we came from Africa. We African American. How we gonna keep walking around here calling, describing, identifying ourselves as two continents? Who else is described by two continents? As a matter of fact, who else is described by one continent? I mean, come on, people, wake up, folks. But we need to remember they hid every trace of our positive history, but made sure to keep comparing us to beasts to reinforce our inferiority, our second, third, and fourth class citizenship status, our societal position as slaves. The more we try to identify as a people we aren't, the further we move away from our true identity. That's why everybody's pushing you to identify yourself with Egyptians and other different groups out of Africa. They pushing you further away from who you are. And we ain't realized it yet. We can go nowhere else on this planet outside of the United States and find just one group of black people who call themselves African. Not even one. I talk to people all the time, especially if I know they came from somewhere else. And I've never ever talked to a person from that continent who ever told me they were African. They've always told me they the country that they came from. I've yet to meet somebody who described himself as an African Nigerian, African Ghanaian, or African Somalian, just to name a few. And even as we take a look at the triangular slave trade, the 13 colonies actually received the least amount of people from the continent we call Africa. But not once have we ever heard these other groups of black people that were shipped to other countries call themselves African. When was the last time you heard the term African Haitian, African Panamanian, African Puerto Rican, or African Dominican, or African Trinidadian, I guess that's how you say it, or African Bohemian? You know, I mean, we've never heard it. And there's been significant research done on DNA haplogroups, and it's been proven time and time again that African DNA and the DNA of blacks in the United States and others in the Western Hemisphere are not the same. Even looking at the map of the place we call Africa, we would see that the largest concentration of haplogroup E1B1A falls into the area on the West Coast with the heaviest concentration at the slave coast. That's because that's where they shipped them to. In the original movie Roots, Kunta Kinte was strung up by the slave master. And the slave master told him his name was Toby, African American. And he kept saying his name was Kunta Kinte, Hebrew, or Negro, whichever one you choose. So the master, who had a black overseer, does this sound familiar? Would instruct the overseer to whoop him each time he said his name was Kunta Kinte, instead of the name the master had given him, which was African American, Toby. But he kept saying his name was Kunta Kinte. For years and years, and right today, the master is still telling us who we are, and has placed black overseers, Jesse, in place to whip us mentally, Malcolm, to make sure we get in line with his naming. And as we see continually right to this day, they're still telling us our name is African American. Toby.